Michelle bid farewell to the homeowners with a wave of her hand, pulling the front door shut behind her. She took a long, heavy sigh, her breath whispering through the silence of the early morning. Although the job was well paid, the homeowner's treatment of her was something she wouldn't wish on her worst enemy. The lady of the house, Alexis Wright, carried herself with an air of superiority given her claimed lineage of royalty, a claim that incidentally was yet to be validated. Alexis's excessive pride and frequent boasts about her supposed ancestry was a constant annoyance to those around her. Every conversation somehow spiraled into a debate about bloodlines and heritage. George, Alexis's husband, had no say in his wife's matters. He was simply expected to sit quietly as she dominated every conversation. Any attempt on his part to intervene was promptly interrupted, often resulting in public humiliation. Despite the discord, they remained together. George had long since adapted to his wife's quirks, opting for a peaceful life rather than constant conflict. As a retired real estate agent, he spent most of his time outdoors, fishing or hunting, seeking solace in nature and away from his domineering wife. Alexis herself was the successful owner of a chain of handbag boutiques. Despite her advancing years, she maintained an elegant appearance, yet her demeanor was less than admirable, with those around her often hoping for a change in attitude. The couple didn't have any children now, but they had once been parents. Their long-awaited son had been the shining star in their lives, the central gravitational force of their universe. However, a cruel twist of fate took him away in a tragic car accident 7 years ago. Michelle had joined their household as a housemaid around the time of their loss. The former housemaid, whom Alexis preferred to call her servant, had hinted at happier times within the house before the tragedy. However, the death of their son, Jared, had brought about a stark shift in the household. Alexis Wright had seemingly gone off the deep end in her grief. What baffled Michelle was Alexis' sudden inclination towards self-glorification and how it could be linked to the loss of her child. Maybe it had been present before, just less noticeable amidst the family's joy. At one juncture, Michelle seriously considered resigning from her position at the Wright household. She was confident that she could find alternative employment without too much difficulty. Michelle was an individual with a warm, pleasant disposition. Despite any negative comments people might make about her line of work, she remained undeterred. There was no shame attached to her profession, she believed. In fact, Michelle held the potential to excel in any career, provided it was within the boundaries of legality and ethics and offered a reasonable source of income. However, Mrs. Wright's eccentric behavior was escalating to an intolerable level. At one point, Michelle started to wonder if these actions were the owner's indirect way of signaling that she no longer wanted Michelle in her house. In such challenging times, Michelle often sought advice from her wise and elderly grandmother, Betty. Betty, with her years of experience and wisdom, would provide Michelle with sage counsel. There were even instances when Betty's guidance prevented Michelle from making hasty decisions that she might later regret. Upon hearing Michelle's account of her difficulties with her current employer, Grandma Betty took a moment to gather her thoughts. She then looked at Michelle with a warm smile. "The very fact that you chose to discuss this situation with me before taking any unilateral action speaks volumes about your character," she said. Next, Betty looked Michelle straight in the eyes, her voice soft yet firm. "Michelle, my dear, you possess such a compassionate heart. Don't let other people's negative emotions affect you. Those who are unhappy often attempt to spread their unhappiness to others. Your best defense is to disregard such negativity. Moreover, remember that growing old is not an easy journey. As individuals age, they can become irritable. You can't always know the challenges they might be facing. Aging brings a multitude of difficulties, and some people struggle to cope with the stress. Therefore, extend some grace to her. Show understanding, and above all, never take her actions personally." Michelle sat, absorbing her grandmother's wisdom, grateful for her guidance. It was comforting to have someone who could bring clarity when things seemed clouded. "I truly appreciate your insights, Grandma. I hadn't considered things from that perspective. That's incredibly insightful," Michelle responded. As Michelle was about to leave, Grandma Betty gently grabbed her wrist at the door. She offered her one last piece of advice. May God bless you with the opportunity to reach the same age as that lady you were working for. When you arrive at that stage of life, you'll comprehend her behavior more profoundly. On a typical day, Alexis would eagerly shadow Michelle, scrutinizing her work with a hawk's eye. But today was different. Michelle let out a sigh of relief, appreciating the absence of the lady's scrutinizing gaze while tackling her demanding chores. Humming a soothing melody to herself, Michelle indulged in the tranquil, undisturbed morning atmosphere as she went about her cleaning routine. After vacuuming the rooms, she moved on to caring for a large indoor plant sitting by the window, its vibrant leaves collecting dust. She reached for a damp rag to clean the plant, her attention inadvertently drawn to the view outside. What she saw brought her bustling activities to a sudden halt. There she was again, the young girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. Her attire was ill-suited for this upscale neighborhood, revealing her harsh circumstances. Her frail figure and shabby clothes hinted at either homelessness or gross neglect by her parents. Michelle had spotted her the previous night too, her heart aching for the girl who seemed to be resorting to begging for survival. However, when Michelle ventured out to offer some food, the girl had promptly fled. Today she was back, standing by the gates and observing the house. Michelle was puzzled by the girl's repeated visits. With a resolved mind, Michelle set down her rag and headed towards the door. On her appearance, the girl attempted to retreat, but Michelle quickly called out, "Please, don't go. Don't be afraid. I won't harm you, I promise." The girl hesitated, offering a wary look in Michelle's direction. Approaching the gate, Michelle opened it with a reassuring smile, taking care not to overwhelm the girl. A quick scan of their surroundings confirmed that the girl was alone. "Would you like to come inside for some food?" Michelle asked gently. The girl remained quiet, standing still. Understanding her apprehensions, Michelle remained patient, trying not to spook her with sudden movements. Despite her frailty, the girl was indeed adorable. Her large blue eyes stared back at Michelle, revealing a world of sorrow and seriousness. "Don't worry, we're alone in the house," Michelle reassured. The girl cautiously took a step towards Michelle. "I'm Michelle," she introduced herself, maintaining her comforting smile. The girl was too shy to utter a word. Anticipating this, Michelle swiftly added, "It's okay if you're not ready to tell me your name. That's perfectly fine. Let's go inside now, shall we?" Extending her hand towards the girl, she watched as the child placed her tiny hand hesitantly onto Michelle's outstretched palm. Michelle cast a nervous glance at her wristwatch, hoping the homeowners were delayed for some reason. She knew Alexis would be far from pleased to find her housemaid deviating from her duties. She gently led the girl into the spacious kitchen. The child stepped in tentatively, surveying the surroundings with wide, curious eyes. "Sweetheart, please make yourself comfortable," Michelle coaxed, gesturing to a chair. She quickly warmed up some biscuits and gravy, placing them on a plate before the girl. Initially, the child eyed the food hesitantly, but after a few moments, the overwhelming hunger seemed to quell her shyness. She started nibbling on the biscuits slowly, and before long she was devouring them at a rapid pace. Observing the girl's voracious appetite, Michelle felt a pang of guilt for serving too much food. She worried the girl might end up a stomachache after not having eaten for such a long time. "Would you like to share your name with me, sweetheart?" Michelle inquired, her voice gentle and comforting. The girl eyed her cautiously for a moment, but eventually seemed to decide that Michelle was no threat. "I'm Sylvia," she murmured softly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Sylvia," Michelle replied with a warm smile. Upon seeing an almost imperceptible smile on Sylvia's face and her lingering glance towards the refrigerator, Michelle quickly understood the silent plea for more food. "Oh dear, I understand you're still hungry, but too much food might upset your stomach right now. How about something sweet instead?" At Sylvia's nod and tiny smile, Michelle retrieved some candies from the upper cabinet. Sylvia took one and popped it into her mouth, her legs swinging under the table, a sure sign she was beginning to feel more at ease. "Sylvia, that's such a lovely name. Do you live around here, sweetheart?" Michelle ventured to ask. "Yes. No, I came here to find my dad." Michelle's first thought was that Sylvia's father might be one of the construction workers at a nearby site and that she might have trailed after him and gotten lost. "Is your dad a construction worker, perhaps?" Michelle ventured to ask. The girl responded with a shake of her head. You said you came here to find your dad. Do you know where he is? Michelle pressed gently. I don't know. He left us. He left Mom. She died when I was born. Grandma says I'm trouble. She also says Daddy is trouble too. She says Daddy hid it and quit it, Sylvia explained in her small voice. Michelle looked at the child with wide eyes, processing her words. After a moment, she asked, So you're not originally from around here? No, I came here. I came here when it was colder, Sylvia responded. What do you mean you came here? Did you come to someone's house or... I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm just trying to understand where you've been staying. Sylvia merely shrugged. I slept in the streets. I got used to it. I often run away from Grandma. She's mean. Michelle shook her head, understanding that Sylvia's story was convoluted and she wasn't gaining much clarity with her questions. So, how are you planning to find your dad? Do you have an address or something? Sylvia shrugged again. Michelle's heart filled with compassion. She couldn't bear to think that this little girl had been living on the streets, possibly among other homeless individuals. Anger welled up in her against the grandmother who had clearly failed to fulfill her responsibilities, leaving the child to seek refuge in a stranger's house. Sylvia, now engrossed with her candy, looked up at Michelle. Can I have some more? Michelle handed her another one, and as Sylvia unwrapped it, she began to explain. Every time Grandma screamed that I ruined her life, she would hold this piece of paper and shake it. The little girl held out a torn piece of paper in her hand. She threatened to send me as a parcel to my dad. When I was smaller, I was terrified she would really do it. I always wanted to rip that piece of paper with the address on it. I thought Grandma would forget the address, and she would have nowhere to send me. One day, when Grandma was asleep, I stole that piece of paper from her, ripped it, and ate some of it. Not all of it, just some pieces, because I thought maybe one day I would want to find my dad. Maybe Grandma lied about my dad being the bad guy. I thought, what if he was actually nice? Sylvia held up the piece of paper. I just have the last letters of the street and the house number. I went to the store, stole a city map, and marked all the streets that seemed to match. Michelle looked at the girl, deep in thought. Are you saying you didn't just stumble upon this house randomly? Sylvia shook her head in response. I've been to all of the other possible addresses. None of them fit as well as this one. This house even has the exact number. Michelle was increasingly perplexed. She fell into a quiet contemplation before speaking. I can't think of anyone who could be your father here. The owners of this house are an older couple, and I don't think they could have a young daughter like you. Sylvia's face fell at Michelle's words. She let out a heavy sigh and muttered, What am I going to do now? If I go back to Grandma's, she'll definitely send me to an orphanage. As Sylvia spoke, Michelle's mind was racing. She thought about the Wright's son who died around the time Sylvia would have been 2 years old. No. That can't be right, she mused to herself, but she couldn't help but wonder. But what if? Sylvia, do you have anything else with you? Perhaps a photograph? She asked. Sylvia brightened up, nodding eagerly. Of course, I always carry it with me. Grandma once threw it at me, even stomped on it. I picked it up and kept it. It's torn, but you can still see his face. Sylvia reached into her pocket, but just as she was about to reveal the photograph, the front door opened. Michelle was so engrossed in her conversation with the girl that she hadn't noticed the arrival of Alexis and George Wright, who were returning from shopping. They headed straight for the kitchen, where Michelle and Sylvia were talking. Upon entering, Alexis' eyes widened in surprise. What on earth is happening here? Michelle, what is this? She demanded. Michelle leaped up, her face blanching. Sylvia was frightened by the sudden intrusion and dropped the photograph on the floor. Hello, Mrs. Wright. You're back, Michelle greeted, attempting to mask her surprise. As you can see, Mrs. Wright responded, her eyes filled with discontent as she glanced between Michelle and Sylvia. She crossed her arms over her chest and raised an eyebrow, her face morphing into a scowl as she took in the scene. So, it seems our house has become some sort of shelter in our absence. Is this what happens when we're not around? Her brow furrowed in annoyance. The little girl crouched in fear, and Michelle quickly positioned herself between Sylvia and Mrs. Wright as if to shield her. "No, ma'am. Please don't misunderstand. This little girl's name is Sylvia. She was standing outside the gates when I saw her." "Silence!" Mrs. Wright interrupted Michelle sternly. "Who is this girl, Michelle? Is she your child?" Mrs. Wright demanded. "No, she's not my child, Mrs. Wright. I'm telling the truth. She was standing outside looking forlorn and hungry, so I thought I'd offer her something to eat." "Why on earth did you let her into the house if you don't know who she is?" Mrs. Wright cut her off again, casting a disapproving look at Sylvia. "I'm really sorry, ma'am. I shouldn't have done that. I thought I'd just give her some of last night's leftovers." "Since when did you start deciding who gets our food? Do we run a charity here?" "I'm truly sorry, ma'am." Michelle was getting increasingly anxious. She didn't know how to respond and hastily offered to have it deducted from her salary. "What salary?" Mrs. Wright scoffed. "You think I'm gonna keep you employed after this?" While Mrs. Wright was berating Michelle, Mr. Wright noticed a creased photograph lying on the floor. He picked it up and upon closer inspection, looked utterly bewildered. "Where did this come from?" He finally spoke, his voice echoing in the tense silence. Mrs. Wright was caught off guard by her husband's sudden interruption. "George, can't you see I'm in the middle of a conversation?" "I'm sorry, dear. Michelle, where did you find this?" he asked, holding up the photograph. "George, are you not listening? What did I just say? Why are you interrupting me?" Mrs. Wright was fuming. Michelle hesitated for a second, casting a quick glance at Mrs. Wright before responding. "Sylvia here was looking for her father. She brought that photograph with her." Upon noticing the pallor on her husband's face, Mrs. Wright's tone immediately changed. "George, are you okay?" But George was too preoccupied to respond. He sat down next to Sylvia and gently asked her, "Sweetheart, where did you get this photograph?" The little girl, already frightened by the exchange, had tears welling up in her eyes. "I nabbed it from my grandma," Sylvia admitted. Mrs. Wright rolled her eyes at the revelation. "Of course you did. Just look at you. We need to review our security footage. She might have lifted something from us as well." George cast a brief, pleading look at his wife, silently imploring her to withhold her accusations for now. "Sweetheart, who are the people in this picture?" George inquired, a hint of melancholy clouding his eyes. Sylvia's face lit up and she answered with evident pride. "That's my mom and dad." George stood up and passed the photograph to his wife Alexis. She carefully picked it up between two fingers and put on her reading glasses. She scrutinized the photograph for what seemed like an eternity before handing it back to her husband. By then, all eyes had turned towards Sylvia. Both George and Alexis, who were initially calm, gradually found themselves in a state of disbelief. They were beginning to unearth an uncanny number of resemblances that Sylvia shared with their son. Every new similarity, every shared habit or gesture struck them like a wave, leaving them more astounded. It was as if they were slowly piecing together a puzzle, and each match added a startling layer of familiarity, further intensifying their shock. Leaning against the wall for support, Alexis's legs suddenly wobbled, and she started to collapse. Michelle and George reacted swiftly, catching her by the arms and guiding her to the sofa. In the flurry of dialing 911, fetching her a drink, and rummaging for her medication, no one noticed that Sylvia had quietly slipped away. By the time they realized she was gone, it was already too late. George whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "How are we going to find her now?" Alexis looked at her husband with an intense stare. "George, you have to find her, do you understand? You must find her no matter what. Oh God, what have we done?" George had left the house, embarking on a search mission for Sylvia. The doctors, too, had taken their leave. Meanwhile, Alexis was left in the quiet solitude of the house, tears streaming down her face. Michelle, moved by the sight, brought some tissues to her and quietly took a seat beside the weeping woman on the couch. "I'm sorry, Michelle. I know my temper is hard to handle. You see, Michelle, I always prioritize my son's future. His lineage, his family, his name, his ancestry, they were all of paramount importance to me. But now that George and I are alone, I've come to understand that there is nothing more terrifying than loneliness. Wealth, lineage, prestige, They all fail in the face of isolation. That girl, Sylvia, she upended my world. Naturally, I have doubts, but when I look at her, the similarities are too striking to dismiss. I'm almost certain she is his daughter. I fear I'll never forgive myself for the part I played in derailing my son's life. Michelle understood that Alexis was struggling with her emotions and simply needed someone to share them with. She sat patiently, providing a listening ear and a comforting presence for the distressed woman. Yet now, Alexis was a stark contrast to her usual persona. Her perfect hairstyle was disheveled, her normally immaculate clothes were crumpled, and her authoritative voice was shaky and uncertain. Her composed demeanor had been replaced with vulnerability and confusion, something Michelle had never seen before. Alexis, the embodiment of poised elegance, was now just a worried and regretful woman, struggling to come to terms with the reality that her world was not as perfect as she had believed it to be. Michelle offered a glass of water to Alexis. She accepted it, took a small sip, and then let her eyes drift shut. She sat like that for a while, lost in her thoughts. After a few moments, she reopened her eyes and started talking again. Jared, my son, always humored me. He would listen to my long speeches about our prestigious family lineage, about the weight of responsibility that comes with the blood of great ancestors flowing in our veins. He would chuckle and gently remind me that the greatness was attributed to those ancestors, not necessarily to us. He insisted that we hadn't achieved anything noteworthy ourselves to warrant being called great. I had even picked out a suitable bride for him. Even though she wasn't a knockout beauty, she came from a highly respected and wealthy family. But Jared had his own plans. I naively thought that I had everything under control. How mistaken I was. One day he introduced us to a girl named Isabella. Alexis paused, noticing Michelle's surprised expression at the mention of the name Isabella. Isabella was half Dominican. Her father was from Dominican Republic, and her mother was white. That was all the information I had about her family. Oh, and she was a college student at the time. But those details didn't interest me back then. All it took was knowing who she was, and that was enough for me to show her the door. The poor girl didn't even have the chance to take off her jacket during her first visit. And then, my only child, my son, left with her. I was in disbelief. I did everything within my power to bring him back. I even stooped to threatening and blackmailing Isabella. One day Jared did come back, but he had changed drastically. He was full of anger and despair. He stayed with us for around 2 years, but those 2 years were absolute hell for us. For the first 2 months, he drowned his sorrows in alcohol every single day. We managed to get him into rehab, and things started looking up for all of us. We even had dinner with the family of another young woman who came from a wealthy background. But a few weeks later, he started falling back into old habits. He took up drinking again. I never imagined in my wildest dreams that he had fathered a child. I know he and Isabella didn't stay together for long. Isabella had kicked him out. Perhaps my threats and blackmails had worked. When he found out about Isabella's death, he drowned himself in alcohol, and then he made the regretful decision to drive drunk. Alexis drew in a shaky breath, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's all my fault, Michelle," she confessed, her voice filled with a raw pain that Michelle had never heard before. Alexis Wright, the woman who had always exuded an aura of stern professionalism, was now vulnerable and weighed down with guilt. "Do you think George will find her? What if he doesn't?" she asked, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. "Don't worry, ma'am. He's going to find her, you'll see," Michelle reassured her gently. "But what if she refuses to come with him?" Alexis posed another question, her worry evident in her eyes. Michelle sighed. "That, I don't know, ma'am. I think the poor girl got really scared." The door creaked open softly. Hearing the noise, Mrs. Wright propped herself up with difficulty on her elbows. Michelle swiveled around and found Mr. Wright at the entrance. He was gently holding Sylvia's hand. The little girl's face was tear-streaked, making her appear forlorn and vulnerable. "We're home." Upon hearing George's words, Alexis made an effort to stand up quickly. Michelle reached out to assist her, but Alexis was trying to regain her balance. She let go of Michelle's hand and started to move towards Sylvia, whose gaze was filled with apprehension. Let's start fresh, shall we? I'm Alexis, your father's mother. What's your name, dear? Sylvia? The little girl stammered, seeming as if she wanted to ask something more but was unable to. Alexis gently placed her hand on Sylvia's slender shoulder. Let's go choose a room for you. Then we can look at the photograph. We have a lot of pictures of your father. Sylvia stared intently at Alexis. Will Dad be here? For a fleeting second, Alexis looked at her husband before responding. I'm afraid your father won't be able to come, honey. He loved your mother very much, and he's with her now. Sylvia took a deep breath and quietly followed Alexis. Half a year swiftly passed. Sylvia was virtually unrecognizable. The transformation she had undergone was extraordinary. She had blossomed into a stunning young girl, always seen in charming dresses and exhibiting impeccable manners. Her peers couldn't help but hold her in high esteem. Alexis showered Sylvia with endless love and exceptional care. She couldn't contain her pride and often spent hours conversing with Michelle about Sylvia's remarkable grades and commendable academic performance. Alexis was truly captivated by her granddaughter's progress and talents. It was a long, drawn-out legal battle. A significant amount of time, effort, and resources were expended to gain custody of Sylvia. Her maternal grandmother was unwilling to relinquish Sylvia due to the associated social benefits. She fought tooth and nail to maintain her claim over the child. Grandma, I'm going to perform on Father's Day, Sylvia excitedly shared one day in the kitchen. What do you mean, perform? Alexis inquired. Come on, Grandma, I'm going to sing, Sylvia replied with enthusiasm. Really? That's fantastic news. Alexis couldn't contain her joy and wrapped her arms around her granddaughter in a tight embrace. You are my precious treasure. Just like Dad. No wonder I took his last name, Sylvia explained. It had been Sylvia's own idea to adopt her father's last name. She proudly told everyone that she wanted to honor her father and be like him. I'm incredibly proud of you, Sylvia, Alexis expressed with warmth. However, in that moment, Sylvia couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. I understand why Dad went to be with Mom, Sylvia began to share her thoughts. I think she was lonely without us and asked Dad to join her. Dad thought about it and decided to leave me in your care. He knew you were kind-hearted and would never harm me. Now, Dad is with Mom, and I'm with you. Michelle turned around, her eyes welling up with tears, while Alexis gently wiped away her own tears. You are such a clever and perceptive little one, Alexis whispered to Sylvia. You are absolutely right. One day, while Michelle was engrossed in folding freshly laundered clothes, George approached her and stood in front of her. He appeared hesitant to speak, an anomaly that Michelle didn't miss. She looked up from the laundry and inquired, Mr. Wright, is everything all right? George looked startled and quickly responded, Who? Me? I'm perfectly fine. What makes you ask? Well, you're standing right here in front of me. Were you perhaps intending to help me with the folding? Michelle said with a laugh. Caught off guard, George stumbled over his words a bit. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I just wanted to have a chat with you. He glanced around surreptitiously to ensure that no one was watching them. I've been wanting to tell you this for some time. You deserve more than just apologies and gratitude. You've been a true blessing to our household. I cannot express how much your efforts have meant to us. Taken aback, Michelle paused in her task, the words leaving her stunned. This was certainly unexpected. I am aware that Alexis has apologized, but you know how she can be, George continued after a pause. Regardless, I don't want you to mention any of this to her. However, I have something for you. He produced an envelope and carefully handed it to Michelle. Please accept this as a small token of our appreciation and forgive my wife for her unkind behavior towards you, George implored. A week later, Michelle and her grandmother Betty found themselves hiking on the Oregon segment of the Pacific Crest Trail. It had been Betty's dream for a long time, and at last, it had become a reality. George's gift had been a check for an amount substantial enough to cover Michelle's mortgage and even allow her to take a break from work for the next decade. George told her that even if she decided to quit her job, he could pay her her monthly salary till he died. However, all Michelle had asked for was a 2-week vacation, which she chose to spend with her cherished grandmother Betty, making her longtime dream come true.